The garage door shrieked against the concrete floor, a sharp sound that cut through the evening silence. Elena Rodriguez stepped inside, the heavy scent of motor oil and undisturbed dust settling into her lungs. This was her only space. Under a single flickering bulb, a folding table held her secrets. Pliers, wire cutters, and a half-finished silver bracelet lay scattered across the surface like discarded dreams. All day, her mind had been trapped in the sterile rows of spreadsheets at her office, where the only patterns were columns of numbers and the only colors were black and white. Here, the metal was cold and real. She ran a thumb over the edge of a copper wire, feeling the resistance of the material against her skin. She sat on a wooden crate, the rough edge digging into her legs, and stared at the mess. It was a cycle of exhaustion, the long, draining commute followed by the hollow quiet of the night. Every piece of silver on that table represented a version of herself that the office could not reach. She picked up the wire, her fingers moving by instinct, but her focus remained fractured by the day. The gap between who she was and what she wanted felt wider than the room itself. She reached for a worn book resting on a shelf, its spine cracked from years of use. Her eyes caught a single line of text. Whatever the mind can conceive and believe, it can achieve. The words sat in the air, heavy and undeniable. She didn't read it twice. She didn't have to. She slammed the book shut, the sound echoing against the concrete walls. Elena stood up, her movements sudden and deliberate. She swept the scattered unfinished projects into a pile, clearing the table until the surface was bare. She grabbed the copper wire she had been holding for hours, but this time, her grip was different. No hesitation. She worked in a blur of motion, the pliers snapping, the wire bending to her will. She didn't look at the clock. She didn't think about the spreadsheets waiting for her in the morning. She focused entirely on the metal, pulling, twisting, and locking it into place. The final loop secured with a sharp click. She laid the finished piece on the clean table. It was the first thing she had ever truly finished for sale. The air in the garage felt different. The weight of the day had finally burned off, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The next weekend, the garage table served a new purpose. She found a piece of white cardboard, propped it against a stack of crates, and positioned her silver bracelet in the center. The light was harsh, casting long, uneven shadows, but she adjusted the cardboard until the metal caught a clean reflection. She snapped the photo, feeling like an amateur. Yet the result on the screen looked like a promise. 2 weeks later, the notification pinged. Her first order. Elena didn't cheer. She froze. She grabbed a small box, lined it with tissue, and placed the bracelet inside. Her hands moved with a strange, shaky precision. She taped the package shut, the sound of the dispenser echoing loudly in the quiet space. The walk to the post office felt like a march. The air outside was cold, biting at her face, but she barely felt it. She reached the counter and stood before the clerk, the box held tight in her palms. She hesitated, her fingers grazing the cardboard, wondering if the piece was truly ready for the world. She pushed the box across the laminate surface. As the clerk took it and turned toward the back, Elena watched it disappear. Her hands were still trembling, not from the cold, but from the sudden, terrifying reality of letting go. The silence started as a hum and grew into a roar. Days bled into weeks, and the inbox remained empty. Elena would sit on her wooden crate, eyes locked on the screen, waiting for a notification that never arrived. She checked the connection, refreshed the page, and stared at the cursor blinking in the dark. Nothing. The garage felt larger now, colder. She started stacking the unsold pieces on the folding table, a growing mountain of silver and wire that looked more like a burden than a business. She traced the edges of a necklace, its surface turning dull under the dim, flickering bulb. Every night, she returned to that same spot, surrounded by the inventory that refused to move. The urge to quit was a physical pressure, a tightness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She looked at her tools, the pliers, the cutters, and they seemed heavy, useless objects in the stagnant air. She left the garage in the early hours, the smell of dust clinging to her skin, wondering if she was chasing a ghost. The silence followed her inside, heavy and persistent, pressing against her resolve until every nerve felt frayed and thin. Elena stopped waiting. She pulled a fresh notebook from under the table and began to break down the cost of every link, every clasp, and every inch of wire. She mapped out the price per gram, her pencil tip snapping against the pressure of her calculations. She shifted her focus to the digital storefront, scrolling through forums and tutorials until her eyes burned. The screen flickered, a jagged line of code across the header, and the checkout button vanished. She felt the familiar surge of panic, but she did not step back. She pulled the keyboard closer, fingers dancing over the keys, rewriting lines of script while the garage air turned sharp with the scent of ozone from the overworked bulb. She spent hours testing the link, clicking and refreshing until the payment portal finally locked into place. The work was endless. She learned to manipulate the aperture on her camera to capture the glint of light on metal, spending entire nights adjusting the lamp to eliminate harsh glare. She was no longer just a maker, she was a technician, a strategist, and a student of her own survival. Her hands were constantly stained with ink and metal dust, but as she clicked publish on a new update, the progress felt like a physical victory. She kept her back straight, ignored the ache in her shoulders, and pushed forward into the dark, determined to force the world to take notice. The garage was quiet, save for the rhythmic snip of metal against wire. Elena was hunched over the table, adjusting a clasp, when her phone buzzed on the concrete floor. She ignored it once, then twice. Before the pinging persisted, she wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the device. A new message request. She tapped the screen, her thumbs hovering over the glass. The subject line was simple, but the text below held her breath captive. "This necklace was a gift for my daughter," the customer wrote. "She wears it every day, and it reminds her of home." Elena sat back on her wooden crate. The garage light seemed to dim, but the words on the screen glowed. She read the sentence once, then twice, then a third time. The metal pieces scattered across the table, once just cold, inanimate silver, now felt heavy with a different kind of purpose. She reached out and touched a finished pendant, tracing the curve of the wire. It was not just a product anymore. It was a connection. The realization hit her with the weight of a physical blow, grounding her to the spot. She looked at her tools, then back at the email, a slow, steady change settling into her chest. She stopped seeing inventory. She started seeing memories. Elena pulled a fresh notepad to the center of the table. She began to rewrite her product descriptions, no longer listing dimensions or materials, but sketching out the hidden histories behind each pendant. She drafted stories of weddings, of departures, and of quiet reconciliations. Her process became an exhausting cycle of creation and documentation. She worked until 2 a.m., the garage air turning thin and cold. Her fingers were mapped with tiny, jagged scars from the wire cutters, and her fingertips were permanently calloused from the silver. Under the flickering bulb, her eyes strained to focus on the fine loops of copper. A sharp pain pulsed behind her temples, yet she refused to stop. She leaned in closer, the glare of the lamp reflecting off her glasses, and spent an hour adjusting the angle of a single bracelet to capture the light just right for her next post. She was trading her sleep for resonance, betting her physical health on the hope that someone else would feel the weight of these stories. Her back ached, her joints stiffened, and the silence of the night pressed against the garage walls, but she kept the pen moving. Every stroke of the ink, every bend of the metal, was a deliberate step away from her old, anonymous life. She was building a bridge between her hands and the world, one story at a time. The trickle turned into a flood. 5 orders became 50, then surged toward the hundreds in a matter of weeks. The garage, once a place of meditative silence, transformed into a frantic center of operations. Packing tape hissed constantly. The smell of oil was replaced by the dry, cardboard scent of shipping boxes stacked to the rafters. Elena could no longer keep pace with the demand alone. She hired her first assistant, then her second. They crowded the small space, elbows bumping as they processed shipments. Elena found herself stepping over piles of supplies just to reach her workbench. The steady rhythm of her own hands was lost to the clatter of voices and the constant thud of packages hitting the sorting bin. She was no longer just a creator. She was a conductor of a chaotic, growing storm. She spent her hours barking instructions, managing inventory lists that scrolled endlessly on her laptop, and fighting to maintain quality amidst the frantic pace. The garage walls seemed to shrink under the pressure of the expansion. Every surface was buried in wire, silver, and invoices. She looked at her 2 assistants, then at the mountain of boxes waiting for the courier, and realized her solitary life had been permanently dismantled. The growth was relentless, pushing her forward with a momentum she could no longer control. The garage was a memory, buried under the silence of her new downtown studio. High glass walls replaced the peeling wooden siding. The air here was climate-controlled, stripped of the scent of motor oil and dust. Elena sat in a chair of molded leather, the city skyline stretching out beneath her window like a sprawling map of her own ambition. She pulled the annual financial statement from her desk. The paper was crisp, heavy, and silent. Her eyes moved down the columns of data until they rested on the final sum at the bottom, over $1 million. She set the document down, the weight of the number settling in the quiet room. She looked around at the expansive, empty workspace. It was a sterile, polished contrast to the folding table that had served as her only foundation. There were no piles of shipping boxes, no clatter of tools, no frantic rush, just the view of the city and the sheer, undeniable reality of the figures on the page. She had started with nothing but a wire and a question. Now, the space around her echoed with the scale of that decision. She was no longer a person struggling to be heard. She was a force that had built its own horizon. She sat still, letting the silence of the showroom ground her, feeling the distance between the girl on the crate and the woman at the helm. Elena held her hands out into the light, turning them slowly. The skin across her fingertips was marked with tiny, jagged lines, faint souvenirs from the sharp edges of copper wire and the relentless bite of pliers. Each scar was a roadmap of the years spent in the dark, a physical record of the work that had turned into this polished reality. She looked at the $1 million ledger one last time, then snapped it shut. The sound was sharp, final, and satisfying. She did not linger on the total. She did not dwell on the history. She pushed the document aside to clear the center of the desk, reaching instead for a fresh, blank sketchpad. She clicked her pen, the small, mechanical sound cutting through the stillness of the studio. Her mind was already moving, stripping away the weight of the past to make room for the next pattern. She pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. The line appeared, thin and dark. A new beginning. Forgil World 1 had even cooled. She took a steady breath, leaned into the light, and began to draw.